welcome to the channel. Today I'm talking about reintroducing decolonized self-care for Black women and what you need to know and how to do it. So earlier this week, after several conversations I've had with other people online, other women, Black women, uh, some in the healthcare field. I work in healthcare. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tonia Barango. I am a women's self-care and health coach for Black women. I teach decolonized self-care for Black women over 45. And this grew out of a mission to liberate Black women from burnout, overwhelm, and just terrible, terrible, terrible health outcomes. Now, excuse me, I'm just going to get my notes here. I also decided to come online to go live because it seems that this is an issue, continues to be an issue for Black women, and it's understandable because the idea of decolonized self care is not widely known. Why? Because it's not in the mainstream. Why? Because it affects largely Black women and people of color. And so the version of, I've said this before in other live streams and other videos, the version of self care that is currently being popularized by mainstream media, it wasn't built for us. When you look at the history of this country, when you consider the history of brutality, chattel slavery, um, terrible, terrible oppression, and a nightmare of experiences during the transatlantic slave trade here to the New World, those structures, all of those things, all of those systems that brought that into being conditions how we experience life in Black bodies, particularly as Black women. And also, it's important to think about that in relation to self care. I've had several conversations recently with Black women. I work in healthcare on the laboratory side of things. And I have listened to, hi there, I've listened to several and had several conversations with other Black women and other women of color around this issue, the notion of self care and their frustrations. They expressed a number of frustrations that they felt like there was just a wall between them being able to do that thing called self care. And I had to explain to them there is a difference between the mainstream self care that you see being popularized by a certain demographic in mainstream media. It's ding, ding, hint, hint. By and large, none of the people, for the most part, look like us. Now, more recently, post COVID and whatnot, we've had Black influencers in the wellness space. But when it comes to actual decolonized self care, that shrinks to this. And so I made it my mission to bring to the fore the whole notion and practice of decolonized self care. And this is why it is so important. It's so important because of our health, our wellness, the health outcomes that are currently coming out in research. And you would think that over the last 30 years, where there have been so many breakthroughs in other areas, why aren't our health outcomes as Black women looking better than what we see? As a matter of fact, they've kind of arguably remained flat in terms of healthcare outcomes. We're more stressed than ever. We're more overwhelmed than ever. When you consider the fact that Black women, our lived experience has at the forefront. It's a unique state to be a Black woman. It is a beautiful thing to be a Black woman, but we have so many points of intersectionality when it comes to self-care that it just makes sense to have something that is our own, that is built for us with our cultural and physical and mental needs in consideration. Now, when I spoke of this before in an earlier live streams, I had talked about the colonized version of self-care, and that is very capitalistic. It's hyper individualistic. It is isolating, very isolating in a number of incidences or instances rather. And it does nothing to heal and create a sense of safety. And it's hard to connect with that. And arguably, I would say when you do manage to connect with the version of self care that's out there as a Black woman, I would argue and say that that's extremely harmful. And it's harmful because it's not culturally relevant. It is a hodgepodge of co opted indigenous practices that have been packaged and commodified for you to buy for the right price. And I've joked around in earlier live streams where I said, you know what? The version of self-care that's out there that's being marketed to everyone and under the sun, it's going to strip your pockets. Now, when you consider that Black women have to work twice, arguably three times as hard as their non-Black counterparts just to get the same opportunities, there's a ripple effect in a number of domains. Pay equity is an issue, discrimination is an issue, racism, systemic racism in all of the institutions on which this country is founded on. So even if you go to the healthcare space, and I've brought up an awesome creator. He's a young doctor, and he's Joel Barville, and he speaks to this regarding medical racism. And it's really, really insightful. He's very insightful in terms of he gives clear and concise examples of what medical racism looks like. So that when you expand it to the arena of self care, it becomes even more problematic. Because what do you have to do in order to nourish, to replenish, to heal? You need a place of safety. And by definition, the conventional form of self care is not a safe space for us. In a lot of instances, you might be the only POC in that space. And so, our version of self care, decolonized self care, and I came up with a definition for that because I noticed a lot of people still have struggle with that term. And I'm just going to break it down by saying that decolonized self-care involves dismantling internalized white supremacy in wellness, your practices reclaiming healing modalities that honor our cultural memory, community, and collective liberation. And as a Black person as a Black woman in the diaspora, when it comes to decolonized self care for Black women, these are all things that we have to consider. We have a collective memory, we have an ancestral memory, we have a number of practices, indigenous practices that we were stripped of when our ancestors were brought to the Americas and the Caribbean, whatnot. And we had to through the creativity of our ancestors, we had to find new ways of surviving and of, in some way, replicating some small aspect of self care. Now, for context, historically, Black women have not been able to access this thing called self care. Self care was not a thing for us because of chattel slavery and the oppressive systems that came with that. Years ago, and it's in the historic record for those who might question that. Laws were put in place where Black women could not be in their homes looking after their families and looking after themselves. There were actual laws on the books. Now, I'm not going to veer off into the weeds about those particular laws because that's not what today is about. Today is about reintroducing decolonized self-care for Black women. And I need us to understand there is fundamental differences between the mainstream version of self care and decolonized self care. Decolonized self care is a reclamation of our ancestral roots, our cultural ways, and healing modalities that nourish and nurture us, not just individually, but in community. And we have to reclaim all of those aspects of our practices so that we can replenish holistically. And what is key here is holistic, integrating. We're reintegrating our own traditional ways of healing and nourishing so that we can get out of the, I often call it self-sabotaging cycles that are destructive. They are maladaptive at this point. The strategies that our ancestors used to survive were just that, survival strategies. We're in a time now where we need to break those cycles of survival, not only because they no longer work, but also because it's time to get out of survival mode. And I have touched on archetypes of that demonstrate those cycles. The sisterella, the strong Black woman, um, the sojourner archetype. I talk about that in one of my earlier live streams. But the point of the matter is this: you are never going to be able to replenish, to self care in a place that's not built for you by design. Even when you look at the infrastructure in this US of A, when you compare it to the infrastructure in other parts of the world, why don't we have more spaces, more green spaces, more, communal places to gather? Racism. Why don't we have socialized healthcare where everyone can access it according to their need? Racism. Why do you have to literally, in a number of instances, and especially in the suburbs, have to get in a car to get to a park? Racism. So all of these structures are at work and they're constantly, constantly, constantly bombarding us as Black women, as Black people, because we cannot escape living in Black bodies. And by design, not only were the structures on which this country was founded were not for us, anything tangential to that, by definition, wasn't built for us. And it's inherent that it's going to be harmful in some regard. That varies along the line depending on what it is and depending on how much you engage with that. And I've had the discussion before where if part of your self-care strategy as a Black woman involves geolocation, a shift in that, that is valid. I am a strong proponent of if you need to move, if you need to leave a place in order to heal, dot, dot, dot. And I have, in a number of instances, put that forward as an option as part of a blueprint, a self care, a long term self care blueprint. I know this channel here is centered on self care for Black women, but also travel and lifestyle. All of that is connected to, is underpinned by self-care. Self-care is the context in which all of this happens and all of these experiences manifest. And so if part of your self-care involves relocation, go for it. I know that is something I have brought up in earlier lives where that's actually something I am considering myself and actively moving towards, because at some point your strategies and your tools you put in and you package for your strategies of wellness and elevation, sometimes you got to move. And in a number of instances, there's only so much healing. um, I think we all understand, if you are a Black woman watching me now or in the replays, we all understand that this, where we are in this current climate here in the USA, not that anti-Blackness isn't global, because it is, but it's not, it's nowhere near as toxic as it is here in the US of A. And that's why, in some instances, if you have the privilege and the wherewithal as a Black woman to move, either, to another state, say you're in the red state and you want to move to a blue state, if that is the extent of your geolocation, go for it. I lean more towards actually exiting the US in a number of instances, particularly given the current climate, social political climate that we're dealing with here in the US of A. And that's something that every one of us will have to make a calculation on and will have to make a decision on. But again, decolonized self-care is rooted in our culture, in our community, in our ancestral collective knowing and healing practices. And I never, if you're wondering why I don't go into specifics on this platform, I've explained before. We are at a time where we are in a reclamation process. And we saw that because a number of us finally got the memo with the election results of last year. And I've been saying this for a number of years, that there are certain ways of healing, of community, of ritual, of recentering and reintegrating and replenishing that must be gate kept, especially in an environment that's very exploitative and is very much into uh, appropriating the cultural knowledge of other groups. And that's what this country is built on. And that's the difference between decolonized self care and the current version that's out there, that's been stolen. It's very fragmented. It's a hodgepodge, like a Frankenstein of other cultural and indigenous practices from around the world. It's been whitewashed and founded on white supremacy and other oppressive systems, and then turned into a little whitewash commodity that you're supposed to buy into. And you wonder why there's such a need for uh, a Black version or a POC version. That's why we have so many versions of things. Why we have to have spaces that cater to our own community because of the toxicity associated with the systems that are in play here in the United States in particular. We exported, this country exported a lot of the toxicity when it comes to racism, all of that, discriminatory and oppressive systems. It was all cooked up here. And wherever else there's anti-blackness, that got exported out there. And that's, I'm going to, leave it there for now. But what I need us to understand, self-care for Black women is a reclamation, and it's a reaching back, reclaiming, and reintegrating our own indigenous and cultural ways of healing and self-nourishing and replenishing. There's an individual aspect of that because you have to do the internal work, but then there's also the communal aspect of it, which is also very important and foundational for your overall process of going on this journey and getting the outcome that you want. Get out of burnout, get out of survival mode. Actually have a blueprint and strategies that really help you to not just get centered, but to heal in your mind, body, spirit. That is in terms of mental health, in terms of your spiritual health, in terms of your physical health. All of these things work together. And one thing that most indigenous cultures have that they share is that understanding of holism and integration. That is absent from the colonized version of self care that's out there. And that's why every time you try to access it, especially as a Black person, as a Black woman, or as a person of color, it's very frustrating. There's literally an invisible wall that you're going to hit. And in a lot of instances, a lot of people end up falling off the wagon because they don't see results. Two, they don't feel any better. I always use this analogy when I speak of the difference between colonized self care and decolonized self care. You cannot expect if you're, say for instance, you come down with, let's use COVID because that's the one that everybody is fully aware of. You go into an environment, how can you expect to go in an environment where everybody is infected with COVID and think that you're going to be okay in that space? You're going to be infected as well. That is the simplest analogy I can give. It's very simplistic, but I need us to understand that the level of vulnerability that you need to have when you go into the state of self-caring, there's a vulnerability involved there because what? You have to open yourself in order to access these spaces that weren't built for us are unsafe. And a lot of us understand, I think we understand by now, even if it's on a subconscious level, that it's not safe. You can't relax in it. You can't. And so, if you can't be vulnerable in those spaces, there's no safety there, then you cannot expect to heal and get what you need. You cannot replenish in a place that is dangerous. And every organism, every animal in the animal kingdom understands that. You're never going to see Bambi and her friends resting and relaxing when they're surrounded by foxes or wolves. That's never going to happen. Everybody who's watched, I'm sure we've all watched National Geographic. You're never going to see antelope taking a snooze in the midst of a lion's pride, a pride of lions. It's not going to happen. They are in survival mode. And I need us to make that connection. And that's why that's actually the power of decolonized self-care. It's a lot of self-reflection involved in that. It's a lot of reintegration and reconnection going on. And it's very systematic and it's very community based. And so that was kind of my rant for today. That's what I needed to get across. I went for the first time live on TikTok to have a similar rant because that was sparked by a conversation I had last night with some colleagues, some Black women, who were expressing to me their frustration in trying to self care and how they weren't really fully in the know in terms of what self care should look like as a Black woman because one, they were having different barriers to entry for the conventional form of self-care, and I broke it down. I said, one, you're hitting a wall because there's something on the inside telling you that's not a safe space, so you're already hitting, that's already a barrier right there to self-care. Two, it wasn't built for you, and something that's not built for you is not going to serve you. End of story. So I need us to start that journey. If this has been helpful to you, please subscribe to my channel. Hit the notification button so that you are aware when I go live again or when I put a video. When I finish this live, I will be adding in the description. I will add some resources. Some are free, some you will have to sign up for and avail yourself of those resources. What I need us to understand too, self care doesn't require, and the very basics of self care, contrary to what's out there, you can practice an effective self care, decolonize self care without spending a whole lot of money. And if finances are an issue for you when you're talking about, I need support in XYZ areas, I do have in my list of live videos where I talk about free resources and how to get your employer to foot the bill for your self-care. And that's in a couple of live streams back. Just go in the playlist. You should see it there. And I discussed that at length about how you can access those resources in your area, wherever you are in the US of A. I know most of my audience is in the US of A, and so this is applicable mostly to us. In a lot of other places around the world, healthcare is not tied to employment. And why is healthcare and all of those goody resources attached to your employer here in the US? Yes, racism. So, yes, funny and not funny. That is the irony of why we don't have a lot of what we should have and access to a lot of what we should have as access as human beings living in this country. Uh, a lot of it is due to that. And I won't go off into the weeds on that. I've, had a rant in other videos about that in other discussions and on other platforms. But this is what you need to know to get started with your decolonized self care journey. I encourage you to, if you have questions, by all means, you can leave them in the chat, or you can book a consultation with me for more. I do intensive consultations because for us, a lot of our needs are situational and very specific. While there is a community component, again, a community component, there's also an individual aspect that needs to be addressed too. And when I talk about self-care too, I'm also talking about safety. Um, I'm just going to briefly touch on the statistics for Black women are not good when it comes to domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And in some instances, in order for you to self care, part of your self care toolkit might involve strategies for navigating those kinds of situations. And this is also why I did drop free resources for accessing licensed mental health providers. You can go to Therapy for Black Girls. They have a huge database of Black and POC licensed providers in your, depending on your area where you can look in that. And again, like I said, I will, once I, terminate this live, I will put in other information and other resources to help women, Black women, start their decolonized self care journey because it starts with you. It is radical, it is a reclamation, and, connection and reintegration. All of that is involved in decolonized self care. And it's not the superficial stuff that's marketed to to the mainstream. It is nothing like that. When it comes to true self care, decolonized self care, there's a lot of unpacking that we have to do as Black women and as Black people. And so our needs are different, our healing modalities are different, and they are necessary. And I specifically do not go into the details of those practices online. That is something I tend to do in consultations and in closed spaces because I believe these are practices that need to be protected, honored, respected, and gate kept. And that is a necessity because we see the end result out there with the whitewashed, colonized version of self care that's currently out there that's largely inaccessible to Black and POC people. It is, you know, gate kept for a certain demographic, and I'll leave it there. So, having said that, thank you for joining me for today's live. Tune in for tomorrow's video. I do upload a video or I will go live again. It just depends on what I feel needs to be addressed further. And so that will be tomorrow. And then later on in the week, I have a tendency to put out, maybe a video or a post as well. You can go to my website, freedom at the crossroads.com, where I have a number of resources and blog posts related to self care for Black women, specifically when it comes to personal safety. I do have some blog posts as well as financial self care as well. There is a live stream on this channel as well regarding that too. So, this is self care weekend, and it's time to reclaim and it's time to decenter. So, having said that, tune in next time. And thank you for joining me. Goodbye. Have a great rest of your weekend. Yes, we do need to gatekeep. We definitely do. It's super important. And that's why I'm so passionate about this. Gatekeeping our practices. I've been on TikTok where there are a number of hoodoo practitioners that were, I think there was, I want to say a couple of months ago, there was this hula baloo about some non-black person talking about they were a hoodoo priestess. We're like, say what again? Mhm. Yeah, that wasn't funny. And so things like that, people trying to access and disrespect spaces that they have no ties to whatsoever. So, yeah. So having said that, I'm going to tune out and join me next time. Bye.